Hello, everyone. Today we're here with Ryan Hutchins of Peak Business Valuation. So, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks for bringing me on, Lindsay. So, Ryan Hutchins with Peak Business Valuation. We work with about 20 to 25 individuals a week who need assistance in understanding the value of a business. So, in short, that is Peak.
Okay. So, why would anyone care about the value of his or her business in a divorce? Why would that be important?
Yeah, so when it comes to divorce, typically a business is one of the primary assets. Beyond your house, most individuals, if they own a business, that is where primary wealth is. And so when it comes to divorce, it's appropriate to take into consideration how that business is to be split and the proceeds kind of shared and paid out to the other party.
So, if there is a spouse who didn't create the business or work in his or her spouse's business, why would they have an interest in the business?
Ooh, great question. Ultimately, that comes down to one, how do your lawyers want to approach kind of looking at the business? Um, if the business was created while the couple was together, then essentially when it comes to uh, who owns the business, it's essentially 50-50 between the two individuals. And so that's why understanding the value of the business is key because inherent in the ownership of the business, those two individuals own 50% each. So if it's $100, they both own $50 each, which if one is primarily working and operating the business and running it, they typically see it as they own 100% of the business and the other individual does not. And so it's more education and telling them, hey, like just by law, it's seen as 50-50 ownership, even if you own 100% and it's under your name.
You kind of touched on this a little bit already, but if there isn't anything you haven't mentioned before, how could a business valuation arise in the context of divorce be helpful for a couple trying to get a divorce who are joint owners of a company?
Yeah, so if they're already joint owners, then it's a more straightforward because both of them have an equity interest in a business. So for instance, let's take two individuals that were not married prior to starting a business. And so they started a business, they ended up getting married, now they're getting divorced and wanted to go separate ways. Like in that instance, it's still treated as if one person owned the business, so it's 50-50. Or if one person owns two-thirds and the other one a third, um, those situations I just leave up to lawyers to determine how to do that split. Because when it comes to valuing a business, we value the business as if you were to sell the company to someone else. So fair market value, hypothetical buyer, hypothetical seller willing to transact, because that's the most fair outcome in the valuation.
Shifting gears just a little bit, how are different businesses valued differently and how?
Oh, that is a loaded question, Lindsay. So every business has its own quirks and other variables and characteristics that either detract or add to the value of the company depending on how it is operated. So essentially, if most businesses transact off of what is considered a multiple of cash flow, um, and in layman's terms, you can almost we'll just use as a synonym, even though it's not correct, the net income over the profitability of the company, because that's a number that individuals know because they can look at their profit and loss and look at it. But the average business typically transacts off of a multiple, which is a representation of risk and return to that of what their cash flow or profit is in the business. And so, like, every industry operates a little bit differently. Some, like, take for instance, accounting or consulting or financial advisory, insurance. Those businesses typically transact off of a multiple of revenue. And the average traditional business, like uh, we're in Utah, so look at a Costa Vida or a Subway, or you look at a plumbing company or an electrical company, those types of businesses will transact off of multiple of profit and cash flow. Does that answer that question, Lindsay?
I think it does a bit.
It's a loaded question. There's every
Is
industry has its own variables to take into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, like a company that sells different auto parts versus a soda shop, I feel like they're going to be valued a little bit different. So,
Correct. They're valued differently, but the methods to which to value the business. For instance, and I we briefly chatted before this call, and you have a question about kind of valuation methodologies. But when you're looking at a business, like valuation professionals like myself and my team at Peak, we're limited to looking at the asset approach, the income approach, and the market approach. These three approaches are used to assess the value of any business. And so, from the stance of performing the actual business valuation, we have our limitations as to how we approach valuing a business. But within the context of the industry in which it operates in, we look at each of those approaches to assess value and look at the ones that are most appropriate in assessing the value for that business.
so what services do you provide at Peak Business Valuation that are helpful to business owners who are divorcing? Is it just business evaluations, or is there something else that helps out
Yeah, great question. So, business valuation is like the core product at Peak Business Valuation, hence it's in the name.
in the name?
Uh,
Yeah.
but we also provide quality of earning services. And the reason why quality of earnings is key is, let's take for instance that so and so owns an electrical contracting company, and there are personal expenses, discretionary expenses, one off expenses run through the books of the company, therefore suppressing the cash flow and the profitability of the company. Then it's key from the business valuation side, like the basis of the valuation circles around the financials. And if the financials are not in good working order, then a quality of earnings comes into play in order to go in and verify all those transactions and assess what is the true cash flow and profitability of the company, and kind of add back all those personal and discretionary and one-off expenses that really are not appropriate to be in the expense section of the financials. We also look at it from the revenue standpoint too. So it's a quality of earnings, in other words, is you're verifying and coming to what is the accurate depiction from a financial standpoint, the cash flow of the company. So that's another service that we offer, just because it always comes into play, especially with divorce, where one partner or uh, these individuals, um, like one of them who runs the business, might be artificially suppressing the profitability in order to show that there is no profit. So we just got to understand what that cash flow is. Otherwise, you're starting on the valuation from a basis that is inaccurate and flawed.
Do you ever get frustrated when you're looking at some people's books for their companies of like what they've done with the money?
Oh, all the time. All the time. Because at the end of the day, like, most people run certain expenses through the business in order to evade paying taxes. And yes, that is appropriate to some degree if it makes sense from a business expense standpoint. But if you're running expenses through the business that shouldn't be there, you're just opening yourself to a potential liability and a tax consequence that no one really thinks of when they do it. They just think, oh, we're not paying taxes. And when you're like outside the context of divorce, if you're wanting to maximize the value of your business and sell that business one day, they're going to look at your cash flow and ask the question, why is this lower than what we expect? Like, what are you doing here? And it's always better to show more profitability, because if you apply a multiple to that profit, you're going to get far more value out of it down the road when you sell the business than if you just evade taxes and just, yeah.
No
Yeah.
company yacht, right, is what I understand.
Yeah, it's a big long story. I've dozens to hundreds of examples, but we won't go there.
Sounds good. You kind of touched on this briefly before, but what steps can be taken to ensure someone doesn't artificially and inaccurately inflate or deflate the value of company when they realize they will get divorced?
That is nearly impossible to do. Just because like there are individuals that we work with that act appropriately and run their business as if they should. But in basically 99 times out of 100, um, there are games that are being played within the business. So it's it's always going to be there. That's why a bulk of our time spent in valuing a business or performing a quality of earnings is spent in the financials, trying our best to understand and ascertain what the true cash flow is of the company and asking the appropriate questions that need to be addressed in order to get to an appropriate figure for the cash flow of the business. But it really just depends. And if, for instance, if we're working with one individual that doesn't operate in the business and they try to get those questions addressed, and the other person that operates in the business knows those answers, sometimes they will not share them or answer them unless it is enacted by a lawyer. So it's really hard. Divorce is a difficult situation no matter how you look at it, and adding a business to it just makes it that much more complicated. And when it comes to business valuation, um, like there are certain business valuation firms that when they represent a particular party, whether they represent one person versus the other, um, they might be like, what's your number? And let's try to argue it and justify it, which is not according to ethics. And so, because at the end of the day, a business valuation expert professional should not care who they're working for, because it still comes down to the same standard of value. So,
You look at like a few years beforehand when you do the evaluations, or is it just currently right now what's going on?
so we will look at historical financials, typically anywhere between 3 or 5 years, or depending on when the business was started. So if it's only been around for a year and a half, we only have a year and a half worth of operations. We also ask for a financial forecast, just because you look at some businesses and you're like, oh, you've been growing at 30 to 40% per year. Like, if that's the case, and based on your Q1 2023 over Q1 2022, it would imply that you're going to continue that same growth rate. We need to factor in forecasted 2023, 24, and potentially 2025. And but if your business is stagnant, not growing, like, you basically can just rely on historical. So yeah, we look at 3 to 5 years of historical financials and then about 1 to 3 years worth of a financial forecast.
So like someone who knows they might get a divorce down the road can't just start closing the business early and not taking phone calls, not going on calls just to minimize the profit revenue they could, because you look at the history of the company as well.
Yeah, correct. If they're planning on, no one really plans to. I don't know. Haven't been divorced, so but if you plan to get a divorce, let's say 3 months from now, like everything behind you is already taking place, and so if you start changing the way in which the business is operating, like someone looking at the financials can be like, um, what happened on this day? Why did you start doing things differently? And they always come up with a good excuse. But yeah, we dig into and we can find and see the anomalies in the trends that were broken based on premeditated actions.
Which kind of goes right into my next question, which is what can be done to prevent a spouse from giving you or the court a false picture of the true value of the company? Do you have people who hide documents from you when you're doing an evaluation?
Oh, great question. So, and I'll touch on uh, like the different types of business valuation professionals within divorce. So, for instance, Peak Business Valuation, we only work with individuals going through a divorce that it's a kind of like there's still good relationship, collaboration, communication, and so therefore like they're trying to settle it. We work with those individuals. We work with individuals going to mediation and arbitration. And in those instances, it's still a good, cordial, like divorce to some degree. And it, when it comes to people hiding documents, it does happen. And we try our best to kind of pull those out and get those documents. And sometimes it will go to mediation and arbitration, and like it won't come up that X, Y, and Z wasn't shared until then. And so therefore a revision has to be made to the business valuation. So that's where Peak plays, is kind of settling cases. When it goes to litigation and you're in court, there are business valuation firms that specialize in what's known as litigation support or expert witnessing, where not only are they providing the business valuation, but they are also testifying in court on uh, whoever hires them's behalf, as well as doing cross examination and looking over the valuation performed by the opposing party and trying to figure out how their analysis isn't appropriate. So there's two different types of valuation firms to work with. Whenever someone ever mentions the term litigation or potential litigation, I always refer them out to those experts, just because you need to know state law and you need to have vast experience with being an expert witness. Um, because in those cases, you spend significantly more time trying to dig up and find those documents, because if it comes up in court that you didn't have that document but it was available to the other valuation firm, like the question will be, why didn't you consider that information if it was readily available? Because this other party had it, you weren't given it, but it was still available, so someone could have found it. So yeah, does that address that question?
Yeah, so there's two different types of business valuation companies, ones that go to litigation and ones that help between settling and mediation. So
Yeah,
there's like a separation.
correct.
And then for people who might be wondering, how much does a business evaluation cost, or how are the costs determined if you don't have like a specific number?
Yeah, that's a little bit more difficult to address because every valuation firm is vastly different. So for instance, at Peak Business Valuation, like we determine the fee based on the industry in which the company operates, the communication level of whoever we're representing and whoever owns the business, and how we're going to get those documents. Because if it's going to take time to collect those documents and get those questions addressed, like that's more time that we're spending to gather. And we also look at the size of the company and the complexity of the divorce. So that is just us at Peak. When it comes to litigation, like compared to our fee, it could be 2 to 3 times more just starting off. And then there is another fee associated with time spent in court appearances. So it could get very costly. So when it comes to assessing the value of a business the first time around, it's always important to understand like the value of the business is what two people are willing to transact at. And if you can't come to terms there, then not only are you paying for lawyers, but you're paying for valuation professionals to represent you in court. And so like your bills just keep rising. And so if the business is the only kind of hostility, like try to figure out a way to cordially figure out how to transact. So that's why one there's a valuation firm that I love out in Georgia, and one of the white papers that they have is when it comes to a divorce, essentially if one party owns 100%, and when it comes to the divorce, the two people kind of are looked at as 50-50 partners in it. Um, the way to think like, oh, if the business appraises at $1 million, like I owe this party 500,000. Like instead of thinking of terms of I owe that person 500,000, like there are ways to go about making it more reasonable from a buyout perspective. Like you could go out and get an SBA loan to buy them out. So there's a lot of options to consider. A lot of people just look at how much they owe outright, and you don't have to owe that outright. You can figure out ways to finance it. So it's only 10% down today, and then you're just paying a monthly principal and interest payment over 10 years, which becomes much more manageable. So long response. So sorry.
You're all good. I think it's smart that you charge people more that take longer to give you documents. That's pretty clever. Um, then going back to kind of divorce questions, here's another one for you. If a business owner feels like divorce is inevitable, what should they start doing to prepare for a business evaluation? So they start collecting documents, or what would you advise them to do?
That is hard. Like, if they know a divorce is inevitable, the first, if you're not working with a lawyer, then looking at getting a business valuation where the spouse is a part of the valuation. So it's both individuals working towards the value of the business versus one party where it can be viewed at from the other's perspective as there could be a level of bias in it. If you know you're gonna already hire a lawyer, like it's a matter of talking with kind of what the steps are with that lawyer. And hey, I own a business, like let's think of this up front. When should we get the business valuation? And how can we get the other opposing party's lawyer on board so that we do this together? That way the business valuation is viewed at as taking into everyone's opinions and information and knowledge. And so it further mitigates any level of bias that can be viewed by the other party. If they're not a part of the valuation, they might feel slighted. And like, yeah. So that's the only advice I could give. Otherwise, I try to stay out of giving that type of advice just because it's very personal, and that's why you have a lawyer involved, because the lawyer has their background and experience to provide and kind of direct. So
And one of my last questions here to wrap up, because I noticed the time. What qualifications must a business evaluator have? So the people that work for you and you, what type of qualifications do you have?
yeah, great question. So a lot of individuals who are seeking a business valuation for their business, one of the first places they turn to is their accountant, because one, they already know their numbers, and two, there's a level of trust But when it comes to qualifications and designations, um, the average accounting firm and CPA doesn't have any background associated with valuing businesses. They can look at and guesstimate, but when and provide an opinion of value, kind of like if you're working with a real estate agent, they'll provide an opinion of value, and then a real estate appraisal comes in. Um, and so it's important to look for individuals that have certain designations. So there's one designation called ABV, which is associated with the American Institute of CPA, so AICPA. So I have a CPA license as well as this ABV designation. Um, there's another organization called NACVA, and they have a license called Certified Valuation Analyst, so CVA. There's another organization called the American Society of Appraisers, and they have two designations, the ASA and the Accredited Member Business Valuation, so AMBV. So looking at designations, but also understanding their expertise and background in valuing businesses. So, for instance, at Peak Business Valuation, we value 20 to 25 companies a week. And so we live and breathe business valuation for small business transactions. So a company doing 200,000 in revenue up to 20 million in revenue, like we value companies going through transactions, divorce, and needing gift and estate valuations. So designations are important, and from there, understanding how many valuations they do is also important, and their background and experience with that particular industry is important. So like take time and interview who you're working with, because if you are heading to court, like at I love it when I have a conversation where they're like, "Oh, we're going through divorce," and it's like, "Cool. Are you heading to litigation?" And they're like, "No, we're heading to court." And it's like, okay, same thing. Um, like you need to be talking to this party because we don't provide the services that you actually need from a court perspective. And like that either comes up at the beginning of the conversation or 30 minutes after we've been talking. So it's important to ask pivotal questions to kind of assess the valuation firm you're going to work with.
Thank you. Do you have any ending pieces of advice or anything you want to share with us as we close up here?
Oh, one of the main pieces of advice for any business owner or anyone who needs a business valuation and is going through a divorce is to understand and take the time to understand the numbers, how they're flowing, like what money's coming in, what money's going out, making sure you have access to those numbers, because that is what takes most of the time when it comes to performing a business valuation for purposes of divorce, is understanding the numbers behind the operations. And most business owners at the end of the day can't tell you how much revenue they did last week or what their weekly expenses are. Like they're in the weeds of the operations that they neglect the numbers. And so understanding the numbers, understanding why certain expenses are taken into consideration, that's where I would spend most of the time prior to going through a divorce. Or if you're going through divorce, or if you're the spouse that doesn't know anything about the business, you're trying to figure out and understand the financials of the company prior to a divorce would be, it'll provide a lot of knowledge and help you ask the right questions. So I don't know if that was the best response.
Well, that was great. That's a piece of advice you have. So if someone wants to get in contact with Peak Business Evaluation, where is the best way and what's the best way to get in contact with you guys?
Yeah, so two ways. You can go to peakbusinessvaluation.com or give us a call at 435-359-2684.
Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, Lindsay. I appreciate it.